solemnly swear that I am up to no good. I'm Alistair Stevens, and this is Dear Mr. Potter. Tonight, in our 60-second session, exploring the wonders and the magic of J.K. Rowling's secondary creation, J.K. Rowling's world of wizards and magic, we're going to begin the fifth Harry Potter novel. We are going to launch ourselves into I believe the original title was Harry Potter and the Uncomfortably Prescient Political Allegory, but then it was renamed to Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which I can completely accept is a much more marketable name, if a somewhat less astute one. The first four Harry Potter novels were published in consecutive years, at least in the UK. The publication history in the US is a little more compressed, but there was a 3-year hiatus between Goblet of Fire and the fifth novel, Order of the Phoenix. That gap was soothed somewhat by the release of the first two Harry Potter movies. We had Philosopher's Stone in 2001 and Chamber of Secrets in 2002, and then in June of 2003 we got the brand new book. Harry Potter was, of course, by this point already a phenomenon, was already rewriting the rules of YA fiction, had in fact established YA fiction as the most important marketing segment for publishers throughout the 2000s, I would argue. But with the blockbuster success of the movies and the ravenous appetite of the public for this, the fifth book, it was already established, I think, as a cultural juggernaut. There is nothing more important in 2003 than Harry Potter. This is pretty much it as far as art and storytelling goes. And obviously, J.K. Rowling had spent every moment of the 3-year hiatus between the publication of Goblet and the publication of Order just writing as many words as she could think of, just writing them in any order that came to her mind. Because while Goblet of Fire was already a surprisingly thick novel, 80,000 words longer than Prisoner of Azkaban, Phoenix is 70,000 words longer even than Goblet. In fact, let's take a look here at some numbers. Let's do some math before we get into our literary analysis to look at exactly how much longer Order of the Phoenix is than every other book. So here on your screen, you guys can find the downloadable slide packet in the show notes accompanying this podcast. Of course, if you were listening to this after the fact, you will see the title of each book, the year that it was released, UK and then US, while there was still a distinction being maintained between those two release dates, the number of words contained in the book, and then a percentage of the length of Order of the Phoenix. So for example, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which was published in 1997 in the UK, 98 in the US, is 76,944 words. You guys, a positively svelte volume, a positively slender little tome there. That is 30% of the length of Order of the Phoenix. Chamber of Secrets, 85,000 words, 33% of the length of Order. Azkaban, 107,000, which still felt like a significant inflation coming off of Chamber, if you recall. 107,000 words for Azkaban, 42% of the length of Order. 190,000 words for Goblet, that is 74% the length of Order. 257,045 words for Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the longest book in the series, which is just spectacular, honestly. Because while it is dense, and while it really moves, it doesn't have the same kind of load-bearing capacity as either Half-Blood Prince or Deathly Hallows, I would argue. I would say that both of those books do more for our understanding of what the Harry Potter story really is. This is a very important book, right? I don't want to diminish the importance of this book. I don't think that there is an unimportant book after Azkaban, really. Like, if there is an unimportant book in the entire run of Harry Potter, you can maybe argue that it's Chamber of Secrets, right? Chamber of Secrets is probably the least important of the 7 books, but this is still important, still significant, still pivotal, and of course, absolutely beloved. Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, released in 2005, comes in at 169,000 words. That is 66%. So we have cut the length of the Harry Potter novels by a third between Order and Half-Blood Prince. And then, of course, Deathly Hallows, which wraps up the whole thing, comes in at 198,000. It is the second longest, but still only 77% the length of Order of the Phoenix. And just because I got into a rut today doing some math, let's take a look at the movies. I find this particular point of comparison absolutely fascinating. Here we have the movies, the release years, their running times, and the number of words that they have to adapt per minute. So back when we do Philosopher's Stone, we're adapting Philosopher's Stone has a running time of 152 minutes. We're adapting 506 words per minute, in effect, right? That is how much story we have to compress onto the screen in order to make the whole thing work. Roughly 506 words per minute. Chamber of Secrets, we're compressing 528 words per minute. 755 words a minute for Prisoner of Azkaban. 1,214 words per minute for Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. But by the time we get to Order of the Phoenix, which is not just the longest book in the series, but also the shortest movie in the series, coming in at a brisk 139 minutes, we are compressing 1,849 words of prose into every single minute of that movie, which may explain why that movie is a little misaligned. It groans at the edges, that film. It feels as though it is overstuffed. Though I have to say, I think I mentioned this yesterday while I was doing the This Week on Point North podcast, the live stream for that show. Order of the Phoenix is, I think, hands down, the most beautiful Harry Potter movie. There isn't a shot, there isn't a set, there isn't a frame of that movie that isn't just gorgeous. Go back and watch Order of the Phoenix. And if you don't enjoy that film, as I know many people don't enjoy that film, but if you don't, stop watching for the story and maybe turn off the sound and just look at it as a piece of cinematography. It is absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. Then, of course, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, 1,157 words per minute. And by the time we get down to Deathly Hallows, which is, as I say, a shorter volume, the second longest volume, but still significantly shorter than Order of the Phoenix, but of course expanded into 2 movies. Deathly Hallows has a running time of 276 minutes combined, which means we're only doing 718 words per minute, and that is your math moment. We're talking a little in the chat here about Angry Harry, and we're going to talk about that, I promise. In fact, I think our second slide this evening is going to, or a second excerpt from the novel itself is going to talk about that. Before we get to that, though, I want to very quickly gloss our structure for Dear Mr. Potter over the course of our discussion of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. There are 38 chapters in this gargantuan tome, and we are going to try to cover 2 per week, which is why I'm talking so quickly, because that means we'll be done in 19 weeks, or 20 weeks if you count the extra week that we will take to discuss the movie at the end. That means that we will be done with perfect discipline, with absolute rigor. That means that we will be done the first week of December, which in reality means that I'm really hoping to finish out our discussion of the novel before the new year. That's what I'm really aiming for. If we can expand this to 23 weeks just for the novel, I think that'll be just fine, but I really want to pay close attention to our page count and to try and get through this book with a certain amount of discipline. It's a very good book, and I am enjoying it. Wow, I am enjoying it so much more in this read-through than I ever have before. This book is even now just in the process of unlocking itself for me, which is just wonderful. I'm so thrilled to be enjoying it so much. I'm reading the physical copy, of course, and I'm also listening to the Jim Dale audiobook, which is just great. I mean, Jim Dale, of course, does Knockout Work. There was some discussion in the chat here earlier about Jim Dale's Hermione, which, yes, is never going to be a favorite, but he gives great Dumbledore. He does excellent Arabella Figg, I will argue. I actually am developing a real fondness for Jim Dale's Snape. He's really winning me over. It's a very subtle performance, but I'm enjoying it a great deal. Right? Good. Okay, so that is going to be our gloss. We are going to start this week, though, with the first 2 chapters, Dudley Demented and A Peck of Owls. For those of you keeping track at home, by the way, that means that we are going to get to Harry's trial in week 4. We are going to get to Hogwarts in week 5. We're going to get to Hogwarts and Luna and Thestrals in week 5. And then in week 6, Dolores Umbridge. We can all, look forward to that. That's going to be a really fun time. Let's begin, though, with chapter 1, Dudley Demented. Let's begin with our by now familiar Harry Potter establishing shot. Though I should say by now familiar, of course, this wasn't present in Goblet of Fire, but all of the other books in the series have given us a version of this cinematic establishing shot. I would argue that this is probably the most successful version of this shot that we have had since Philosopher's Stone. I think that the opening to Philosopher's Stone is genuinely magical, like truly magical in a fairy tale sense. And we've kind of deliberately, consciously stepped away from that in the subsequent novels, but I think that this is equally effective, though of course very different in tone. This is how we begin Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. The hottest day of the summer so far was drawing to a close, and a drowsy silence lay over the large, square houses of Privet Drive. Cars that were usually gleaming stood dusty in their drives, and lawns that were once emerald green lay parched and yellowing. The use of hosepipes had been banned due to drought. Deprived of their usual car washing and lawn mowing pursuits, the inhabitants of Privet Drive had retreated into the shade of their cool houses, windows thrown wide in the hope of tempting in a non-existent breeze. The only person left outdoors was a teenage boy who was lying flat on his back in a flower bed outside number 4. He was a skinny, black-haired, bespectacled boy who had a pinched, slightly unhealthy look of someone who has grown a lot in a short space of time. His jeans were torn and dirty, his t-shirt baggy and faded, and the soles of his trainers were peeling away from the uppers. Harry Potter's appearance did not endear him to the neighbours, who were the sort of people who thought scruffiness ought to be punishable by law, but as he had hidden himself behind a large hydrangea bush this evening, he was quite invisible to passers-by. In fact, the only way he would be spotted was if his Uncle Vernon or Aunt Petunia stuck their heads out of the living room window and looked straight down into the flower bed below. On the whole, Harry thought he was to be congratulated on his idea of hiding here. He was not, perhaps, very comfortable lying on the hot, hard earth. But on the other hand, nobody was glaring at him, grinding their teeth so loudly that he could not hear the news or shooting nasty questions at him, as had happened every time he had tried sitting down in the living room and watching television with his aunt and uncle. Rohit is calling out in the chat here, this is also the first book that doesn't have a Harry Potter was a very unusual boy. His parents were killed by the evil Lord Voldemort basic intro spiel. By this point, we're in the story completely. Don't need the YA style recap. You're absolutely right, Rohit. That is a very astute observation. I think that is proof, if proof were needed, of the cultural phenomenon that was Harry Potter by the time that we get to 2003, right? The gap between Goblet and Order is so significant, is so profound that in many ways, we talked about this when we were discussing Goblet of Fire, in fact, that Goblet is in many ways the book in which Harry Potter as a series, and certainly Harry as a character, become self-aware, that they become to a certain degree self-reflexive. They become conscious and mindful and playful even in terms of the stories that they are telling. That I think is true in Goblet, but it is almost subtextual. By the time we get to Order, this is absolute text, right? This is a phenomenon. It is impossible not to be aware of Harry Potter when you are reading Order for the first time. So that is a powerful distinction. I think that we have moved past the point where we have to do the regular introductory business. The same is true of Hermione and of Ron and of Dumbledore, right? The same is true of many, many of our incidental characters. We are now speaking to, well, a very, very large and very, very enthusiastic choir, I suppose. But yes, it's a great observation to catch that. Yeah, Joseph saying there must have been many disappointed readers expecting a story taking place in suburban Arizona just to find all this confusing English stuff. Joseph, we're 13 minutes into tonight's session, and that is the first Phoenix, Arizona joke. Good job. Yes, of course, this does have very different meanings, though it is not inappropriate at all to talk about Arizona in the context of this opening page, which is perhaps surprising. Drought and heat have come to suburban England, and if there is anything that suburban England is ill prepared for, it is heat. We can tell that, right? This is a period of discomfort. That is clear. We are not accustomed to this new world in which we find ourselves. We have no provision made for surviving the heat or the drought. Cars are dusty, lawns are yellowed and parched. We have the hosepipe ban, even windows being thrown open in the hope of a breeze. Houses in Britain, by and large, do not have air conditioning. This is one of the revelations that I had when I came here to the United States for the first time. Houses in Britain do not have air conditioning because there is basically in Britain no need for air conditioning. For, 98% of the time, you are never going to miss the absence of an AC unit or AC provision in your house. But when you need it, you really need it. So we have windows cast open, proof that we have not anticipated this movement. The world is uncomfortable with itself. Even Harry, we meet our hero laying in a flower bed outside the living room window. This is our introduction to the protagonist of the series. This is our introduction. Okay, let us not be coy. This is not our introduction to the protagonist of the series. We all know Harry, right? The last time we saw Harry, he was, well, grieving for Cedric, yes, but also the triumphant Triwizard Tournament champion, right? He had conquered everything. He had overcome all these obstacles. He was riven by grief. He was absolutely stricken by it and by the return of Voldemort too, of course. But he was not reduced to laying on the hot, hard earth outside the living room window, trying to listen in on the evening news. This is a world out of alignment with itself, which gives us the first indication of this this creeping sense that something is wrong. This is going to be the kind of minor note accompaniment to everything that we discuss in at least the first half of Order of the Phoenix, honestly. There is just going to be this quiet, gentle, distant sound of discord. We are going to feel that the world is not as it ought to be. And this is our introduction right here in the opening. And not just our introduction to that, of course, but our introduction to something that we'll discuss in the context of the next slide. Harry's personality. Let's charitably say Harry's personality. On the whole, Harry thought he was to be congratulated on the idea of hiding here. He was not perhaps very comfortable lying on the hot, hard earth, but on the other hand, nobody was glaring at him, grinding their teeth so loudly that he could not hear the news, or shooting nasty questions at him, as had happened every time he tried sitting down in the living room and watching television with his aunt and uncle. Okay, Harry, fair play, I can understand that you don't necessarily want to sit in the living room and watch the television with your aunt and uncle, with the Dursleys, but at the same time, you are lying on the ground in the dog days of summer. You are lying out here in a flower bed and you feel you ought to be congratulated. And let's distinguish this still further, right? It is not that this is not a terribly inspired bit of, MacGyvering that Harry has managed to put together here. He's just lying in a flower bed, you guys. This isn't that great. But Harry thought he was to be congratulated on his idea of hiding here. Not Harry thought it was a good idea, or Harry was satisfied with the decision that he had made. Harry thought he ought to be congratulated. Harry is, even in this, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but I do want to highlight it as a primer for what is to come. Even in this opening excerpt, Harry is externalizing his response. He is looking for validation in a way that Harry hasn't really looked for validation before. We've just come through the Triwizard Tournament. We've just come through Harry being reviled by everyone. In fact, we've just come through Harry being reviled in his 4th year at Hogwarts, and his 3rd year at Hogwarts, and his 2nd year at Hogwarts. And certainly people are pretty damn suspicious of him during his 1st year at Hogwarts. Harry is not the kind of person who generally seeks or expects congratulations, particularly for his decisions. Let's look at how significant this is as we move into the second slide. And I'm going to apologize right now. There is no hope at all that I can keep up with the chat tonight. If you guys want to ask me questions in the chat, be sure to use the little ask a question option that you have at the bottom of your screen, because there is no hope that I'm going to keep up with this. Let's move into the second slide then. This is after Harry walks off in a huff. He has been reassured that the evening news contains no word of the return of Lord Voldemort, that the apocalypse has not yet come, or at least news of it has not yet reached Muggle television here in Little Whinging, so he walks off after being driven off, in effect, by Vernon and Petunia. He walked on, hardly aware of the route he was taking, for he had pounded these streets so often lately that his feet carried him to his favourite haunts automatically. Every few steps he glanced back over his shoulder. Someone magical had been near him as he lay among Aunt Petunia's dying begonias. He was sure of it. Why hadn't they spoken to him? Why hadn't they made contact? Why were they hiding now? And then, as his feeling of frustration peaked, his certainty leaked away. Perhaps it hadn't been a magical sound after all. Perhaps he was so desperate for the tiniest sign of contact from the world to which he belonged that he was simply overreacting to perfectly ordinary noises. Could he be sure it hadn't been the sound of something breaking inside a neighbor's house? Harry felt a dull, sinking sensation in his stomach, and before he knew it, the feeling of hopelessness that had plagued him all summer rolled over him once again. Tomorrow morning he would be awoken by the alarm at 5 o'clock so that he could pay the owl that delivered the Daily Prophet. But was there any point in continuing to take it? Harry merely glanced at the front page before throwing it aside these days. When the idiots who ran the paper finally realized that Voldemort was back, it would be headline news, and that was the only kind Harry cared about. If he was lucky, there would be owls carrying letters from his best friends, Ron and Hermione, though any expectation he had about their letters, that their letters would bring him news, had long since been dashed. We can't say much about you-know-what, obviously. We've been told not to say anything important in case our letters go astray. We're quite busy, but I can't give you details here. There's a fair amount going on. We'll tell you everything when we see you soon. But when were they going to see him? Nobody seemed too bothered with a precise date. Hermione had scribbled, "I expect we'll be seeing you quite soon," inside his birthday card, but how soon was soon? As far as Harry could tell from the vague hints in the letters, Hermione and Ron were in the same place, presumably at Ron's parents' house. He could hardly bear to think of the pair of them having fun at the Burrow while he was stuck in Privet Drive. In fact, he was so angry at them that he had thrown both their birthday presents of Honeyduke's chocolates away unopened, though he'd regretted this after eating the wilting salad Aunt Petunia had provided for dinner that night. a great deal here to unpack. So we've had the sudden crack, the sound of apparition or disapparition, right? We've had the magical sound that Harry has heard, which prompts him to leap to his feet and bang his head very badly, which reveals his presence to Vernon and Petunia. So now he is out walking. He's frantic. Someone magical had been near him as he lay among Aunt Petunia's dying begonias. He was sure of that. Why hadn't they spoken to him? Why hadn't they made contact? Why were they hiding now? And then as his feeling of frustration peaked, his certainty leaked away. Well, maybe it hadn't been a magical sound. Maybe it hadn't been something significant. Maybe it hadn't, in fact, been part of the plot of this story. Spoilers, it turns out that it was kind of tangentially. But Harry is aware that he is yearning for, that he is seeking, that he is even on the brink of fabricating evidence that he is still connected to the magical world. Perhaps he was so desperate for the tiniest sign of contact from the world to which he belonged that he was simply overreacting to perfectly ordinary noises. A very important piece of identity there for Harry, almost a piece of appropriation, right? The wizarding world is the world to which he belongs. That's why he is so sensitive to thoughts of magic and to the possible sounds of magic. He wants evidence of the wizarding world, the world to which he belonged. By inference, therefore, he is not in the world to which he belongs, that he is not a part of the wizarding world. He is here in the mundane realm, in the muggle realm. This is significant. This is important because one of the things that is going to be challenged through the course of this book, one of the things that is going to be changed pretty much, we are in effect past the internal point of inflection with regard to this plot, but we haven't yet reached the external point of inflection for this plot. We are not going to meaningfully distinguish the magical world from the muggle world going forward, right? Voldemort is a threat to both. A threat in a different way, perhaps, but he is absolutely a threat to both. The idea that these two worlds are isolated, as they have been so consistently in the previous books in the Harry Potter series, is now going to be set aside. This is a war. The Second Wizarding War is going to transcend the boundary between the wizard world and the muggle world. We're going to continue to study that as we go forward. We're talking a little about the crack of the disapparition. Yeah, Dry Heaving Llama says, I wonder if the crack of apparition is more like a crack of the whip or the crack of two objects hitting each other. As a few people are saying here, Clambert and Becca, I think, are both saying here that, and Recyclops too, it's the crack from rapid air pressure change, so more like a whip. Yeah, it is the crack of air rushing in because nature abhors a vacuum. When you apparate, you apparently take some of the air with you, or at least there is the air that would otherwise be occupying the space that you are occupying. We don't quite know how clear and clean and person specific apparating is, but when you go, yeah, it creates a vacuum, and the crack that we hear is the sound of the air rushing in to fill that void. That is certainly my reading of it, but perhaps there's a giant knuckles cracking, says Joseph Shannon. My wife would shudder, as would I. I kind of hate the knuckle cracking thing. It's very disquieting sound. So here we are with Harry, all right, already yearning for the wizarding world, feeling himself very disconnected from it. He doesn't even have faith anymore in letters from his friends. He's possibly going to receive more letters from his friends, but they're not going to contain anything. But when were they going to see him? Nobody seemed too bothered with the precise date. Hermione had scribbled, I expect we'll be seeing you quite soon, inside his birthday card. But how soon was soon? In fact, so piqued is Harry, so angry is Harry, to use for the first time a word that we are going to use a lot in this session, in this series of Dear Mr. Potter. So angry is Harry that he casts the Honeyduke's chocolates into the trash. So, angry Harry. This is going to be an ongoing issue with the book, and while I don't want to jump the timeline too much, right? I don't want to talk about things that are going to happen much, much later in the book because I want to pay attention to where we are and I want to preserve our right to talk about those later events when we get to them later. I do think it's important to talk about Harry's personality in the course of this book, which is challenging to very many readers, right? Lots of readers dislike the depiction of Harry in this book. They find him angry, they find him short-tempered, they find him fractious, they find him difficult, they find him ornery. Pick your adjective of choice, in effect. But lots of readers find Harry very difficult to connect with as we move through this book. And it seems to me that there are a handful of different reasons, ranging from the very likely and very significant to the less likely or less significant, right? Perhaps the most important is something like post-traumatic stress disorder that Harry is experiencing now, following just the events of the Triwizard Tournament. Never mind the death of Cedric Diggory, though also, yes, obviously the death of Cedric. I say something like post-traumatic stress disorder because I think that we generally end up in trouble when we try to diagnose fictional characters with very limited information, right? If the book tells us Harry was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, here are some things that you can read about that, then we can lean in that direction a little more. But when we diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder based on the actions and the emotional responses of Harry Potter in the course of this novel, we are perilously close to the line of ignoring the text when we're thinking about the diagnosis rather than what is on the page before us. So I don't want to say that Harry is suffering from PTSD, hard and fast. What I am willing to say is that he is probably suffering from something like PTSD. It may be PTSD, but I don't want to ignore the text of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix while paying close attention to the text of the Wikipedia page on PTSD, for example. So certainly something like PTSD, something like feeling excluded from his friends, from Hermione and Ron specifically, but also by extension from the fun in the Burrow, right? A broader sense of community, and even beyond that sense of community, being excluded from the start of the Second Wizarding War. That seems to be something that's very important to Harry too. He is, of course, wounded, jaded is too thin a word. Jaded is too insubstantial and whimsical a word to describe the kind of spiritual wound that Harry has suffered at this point. He has been robbed of his innocence. He has been robbed of his optimism. He has been robbed of his hope. It has been revealed to Harry in the course of Goblet of Fire, even arguably going back to Prisoner of Azkaban too, it has been revealed to Harry that the wizarding world is not just, that the Ministry is more concerned with the status quo than it is with truth, than it is with real authenticity, I suppose. This is a difficult thing for anyone to learn. It is certainly a difficult thing for a hero, a heroic personality like Harry to learn too. So he has been jaded. He has been wounded by that revelation. He is also, of course, probably suffering from adolescent mood swings, from that rush of that new hormonal deluge that is conquering his body even as we speak. Though I want to be super clear about this. I am emphatically less interested in that interpretation than I am in any of the other possible interpretations, because I feel like A, it does J.K. Rowling and it does Harry Potter himself something of a disservice, and B, let's be clear, here in the year 2018, we are on a hell of a slippery slope anytime that we are willing to diminish or devalue or invalidate anyone's emotional response, anyone's emotional interiority by shrugging and giving a little self-satisfied and somewhat smug, hormones, am I right? Teenagers, am I right? Women, am I right? Like, this is not okay. This is not a thing that we should be doing. We ought not, we must not deny the emotional interiority of others. That is incredibly dangerous, and it has never been more relevant, either in the context of the tyrannical dystopia that is being presented to us in the pages of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, or, the tyrannical dystopia that is happening outside of your window right now. More importantly, though, while all of these things are true, while it is true that Harry is an adolescent, while it is true that he is probably jaded and wounded by his revelations about the course and the nature of the wizarding world, while it is certainly true that he is probably suffering from some kind of PTSD or PTSD-adjacent disorder, right? All of that is true, but this is much more important. Voldemort is back, and Voldemort is, as we already know, connected to Harry. We don't need to know at this point about the mechanics of that connection. We don't need to know any more than we already do, any more than was revealed to us by the confrontation in Little Hangleton about the means and the mode of that interaction between Harry and Voldemort, but it is enough to know that they are connected. We've emphasized that connection repeatedly, in fact. One of the arguments that I am going to be making as we move through Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is that Harry is not just angry. Harry is actually feeling and experiencing a rich emotional palette. It's just not his native emotional palette. My argument is going to be that Harry is being emotionally influenced by the presence of Voldemort, and the emotional differences that we note in Harry, that he is short-tempered, that he is irritable, that he is given to anger and fury and thoughts of vengeance and violence, crucially thoughts of vengeance and violence, very un-Harry-like, that these thoughts do not come from nowhere, and they aren't a simple product of a neurochemical imbalance or a neurochemical transition within Harry, or a psychological transition within Harry, or a psychological disorder within Harry, right? I don't think that any of those things are as important, reading the text of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, as his connection to Voldemort. These things aren't random. They are reflective of Voldemort's personality. This is Voldemort's sense of self-righteous injustice and his sense of aggression, his desire for violence, his desire for domination, his desire for praise and for acclaim, right? Remember in the very first slide when we're talking about Harry felt that he ought to be congratulated. When has Harry ever felt that he ought to be congratulated? Voldemort wants acclaim. That is one of the things that drives him. As we talked about during our discussion of Goblet of Fire, he is possessed of the greatest wizarding ego of the age. So we're not going to spend too long on this, but I'm kind of planting my flag in the ground here as we move forward. Harry isn't just angry or moody or sulky, and God forbid Harry is definitely not just being a teenager in Order of the Phoenix. He's under the admittedly subconscious, admittedly at least initially inadvertent influence of Voldemort. Speaking of which, let's look at our third slide, shall we? Now that we've got all of this material out of the way, let's keep looking. In the meantime, he had nothing to look forward to but another restless, disturbed night, because even when he escaped nightmares about Cedric, he had unsettling dreams about long, dark corridors, all finishing in dead ends and locked doors, which he supposed had something to do with the trapped feeling he had when he was awake. Often the old scar on his forehead prickled uncomfortably, but he did not fool himself that Ron or Hermione or Sirius would find that very interesting anymore. In the past, his scar hurting had warned that Voldemort was getting stronger again, but now that Voldemort was back, they would probably remind him that its regular irritation was only to be expected. Nothing to worry about. Old news. The injustice of it all welled up inside him so that he wanted to yell with fury. If it hadn't been for him, nobody would even have known Voldemort was back, and his reward was to be stuck in Little Whinging for 4 solid weeks, completely cut off from the magical world, reduced to squatting among dying begonias so that he could hear about water-skiing budgerigars? How could Dumbledore have forgotten him so easily? Why had Ron and Hermione got together without inviting him along too? How much longer was he supposed to endure Sirius telling him to sit tight and be a good boy, or resist the temptation to write to the stupid Daily Prophet and point out that Voldemort had returned? These furious thoughts whirled around in Harry's head, and his insides writhed with anger as the sultry, velvety night fell around him, the air full of the smell of warm, dry grass, and the only sound that of the low grumble of traffic on the road beyond the park railings. Harry. No, Ryan asking, what, pray tell, is a budgerigar? A budgie is a small pet bird, like a canary, I suppose, something like that. Do they not have budgerigars in the United States? Is that a transatlantic definition? Do you call them something else here? I have no idea. I have never owned a budgerigar or known anyone who has known a budgerigar, but they are absolutely iconic. They are symbolic of exactly that kind of conventional middle-class suburban living, right? You have your 2.4 children, your white picket fence, your car in the driveway, and your budgerigar inside. Sometimes you might go as far as a fish, right? Like sometimes. But cats and dogs are, I suppose, a little too rural by the time that we're talking about this kind of manicured suburbia. Yeah. Okay. So this is proof, I guess, of exactly what I was just talking about, right? This sudden rush of fury that feels completely unlike the Harry that we know and love by this point. But it's also connected, of course, with these dreams, with these visions, unsettling dreams about long, dark corridors, all finishing in dead ends and locked doors, which he supposed had something to do with the trapped feeling he had when he was awake. Yeah, it might have something to do with the trapped feeling you have when you're awake, Harry. Gosh, excuse me. We should note too that it is at this point August the 2nd. This is August the 2nd. It's a couple of days out from Harry's birthday when he threw all of that perfectly good Honeyduke's chocolate in the trash. It is now 39 days, 5.5 weeks after the resurrection of Lord Voldemort at the graveyard in Little Hangleton, and 32 days after the end of term feast honoring Cedric Diggory. So when he says 4 solid weeks, he really is saying 4 solid weeks. It has been almost exactly 4 weeks since he returned to Privet Drive, returned to the Muggle realm, as it were. Budgies are also a Canadian thing. Okay, excellent. I'm very glad. Yeah, budgie equals parakeet, says Karen. Oh, also Wendy confirms that. Excellent. And C-Star, as is C-Star's way, just drops a Wikipedia link in the chat. Excellent, good. Alice been saying, I've literally never heard budgie in the US, where I'm from, New England, so I don't know. That's so fascinating. I have no idea how that works. That's it's so strange. You know, the two nations divided by a common language, as it were. Okay. Let's get to it, though, right? This is the discussion of Harry's restless nights. We now know that Harry is feeling, or we can suspect, we can assert, I will assert, that Harry is feeling this emotional tension, this emotional distance that is not entirely like him, which I think we can pull specifically, right? How could Dumbledore have forgotten him so easily? Does Harry really think that Dumbledore has forgotten him? Why had Ron and Hermione got together without inviting him along too? Is that really what happened? How much longer was he supposed to endure Sirius telling him to sit tight and be a good boy? Well, yeah, this is not, I think, quite Harry. We'll talk about that as we continue to move forward. Let's get to our confrontation with Dudley, or the first part of our confrontation with Dudley. We should frame this out too, of course, that one of the things that we will see from Harry in the course of this book is a predilection for violence, a instinctive turning to violence and to aggression in a way that he never has before. This is atypical for Harry, and will be atypical for Harry in the rest of the series too. Another thing that plays into this idea that Harry is not entirely himself. So having already fantasized about running up against Dudley, he finally gets the opportunity. Running to Daddy now, are you? Is his ickle boxing champ franked of nasty Harry's wand? Not as brave at night, are you? Sneered Dudley. This is night, Diddykins. That's what we call it when it goes all dark like this. I mean when you're in bed, Dudley snarled. He had stopped walking. Harry stopped too, staring at his cousin. From the little he could see of Dudley's large face, he was wearing a strangely triumphant look. What do you mean I'm not brave in bed? Said Harry, completely nonplussed. What, am I supposed to be frightened of pillows or something? I heard you last night, said Dudley breathlessly, talking in your sleep, moaning. What do you mean? Harry said again, but there was a cold, plunging sensation in his stomach. He had revisited the graveyard last night in his dreams. Dudley gave a harsh bark of laughter, then adopted a high-pitched, whimpering voice. Don't kill Cedric! Don't kill Cedric! Who's Cedric? Your boyfriend? You're lying, said Harry automatically, but his mouth had gone dry. He knew Dudley wasn't lying. How else would he know about Cedric? Dad! Help me, Daddy's gonna kill me, Dad! Boo-hoo! Shut up, said Harry quietly. Shut up, Dudley, I'm warning you. Come and help me, Dad! Mom, come and help me, he's killed Cedric! Dad, help me, he's going to... Don't you point that thing at me! A fight is about to break out. Dudley is, of course, utterly awful, but this outright provocation from Harry is also very disconcerting. It is disquieting. It is unfamiliar to us. Is his ickle boxing champ frightened of nasty Harry's wand? This kind of goading. Even the great response, which I think we can appreciate from a literary point of view, we can appreciate this is night, Diddykins. That's what we call it when it goes all dark like this. Like, okay, Harry, like, good sassy response. Good top 10 out of 10 sassy Harry response. I'm into that. But it's still provocative. It's still aggressive. It is swaggering and that kind of bullying confidence that betrays an inner insecurity, right? It is not unlike Dudley. They are matching each other beat for beat here. And there is an internal inconsistency to Harry's emotional response. He had stopped walking. Harry stopped too, staring at his cousin. From the little he could see of Dudley's large face, he was wearing a strangely triumphant look. What do you mean I'm not brave in bed? Said Harry, completely nonplussed. Oh, he's completely nonplussed. He's so completely nonplussed, in fact, that he stops and stares and notes the triumphant look. He is not in any way empathically connected to Dudley in this moment. He is so insufficiently just personally connected to Dudley that he can't jump to the obvious conclusion that Dudley is talking about something real, that Dudley is talking about something specific here. Rahit says in the chat, just like most people, Harry is coping with his frustrating lack of power by exercising power over the only person he feels superior to right now. That is very fair, right? That is absolutely fair. And that's a good reminder to Rahit, thank you for this, that when I'm talking about Harry being influenced by Voldemort, that doesn't mean that that is happening in a vacuum. It doesn't mean that Harry is, we should have just titled tonight's session, in fact, Nature Abhors a brackets, emotional, close brackets, vacuum. That doesn't mean that Harry is just having his emotions transplanted or having emotions transplanted from Voldemort into himself, right? That is not, I think, exactly what is happening. It is more of a corruption. It is more of an inclination. It is more of an influence. So Harry is, of course, leaning on those emotional crutches and those emotional conventions, which are familiar to him at that time. Yeah. Let's I'm well aware that I'm already running behind and promised to get through 2 slides. So let's move on and get to... This doesn't tell us anything that we don't already know, of course. It's just emphasizing that distinction between Harry and Dudley so that we can get to the arrival, well, of something very, very bad indeed. Something had happened to the night. The star-strewn indigo sky was suddenly pitch black and lightless. The stars, the moon, the misty street lamps at either end of the alley had vanished. The distant grumble of cars and the whisper of trees had gone. The balmy evening was suddenly piercingly, bitingly cold. They were surrounded by total, impenetrable, silent darkness, as though some giant hand had dropped a thick, icy mantle over the entire alleyway, blinding them. For a split second, Harry thought he could have done magic without meaning to, despite the fact that he'd been resisting as hard as he could. Then his reason caught up with his senses. He didn't have the power to turn off the stars. He turned his head this way and that, trying to see something, but the darkness pressed on his eyes like a weightless veil. Dudley's terrified voice broke in Harry's ear. What are you doing? Stop it! I'm not doing anything. Shut up and don't move. I can't see. I've gone blind. I said shut up. Harry stood stock still, turning his sightless eyes left and right. The cold was so intense he was shivering all over. Goosebumps had erupted up his arms, and the hair on the back of his neck was standing up. He opened his eyes to their fullest extent, staring blankly around, unseeing. It was impossible. They couldn't be here. Not in Little Whinging. He strained his ears. He would hear them before he saw them. Oh, tell Dad! Dudley whimpered. Where are you? What are you... Will you shut up? Harry hissed. I'm trying to listen. But he fell silent. He had heard just the thing he had been dreading. There was something in the alleyway apart from themselves, something that was drawing long, hoarse, rattling breaths. Harry felt a horrible jolt of dread as he stood trembling in the freezing air. I'm going to skip out on this slide and go back to the previous slide because Wilhelm Scream is observing something that I really wanted to note in the chat. I really wanted to note in context of the discussion of the last slide. Wilhelm Scream says in the chat, Dudley's line about your boyfriend is certainly immature, uninformed homophobia, but it is possible here in 2018 to imbue that with more conscience than Rowling wrote. Perhaps Dudley could be teasing him about being in love with his boyfriend. The love and whining part being teaseworthy, not any judgment of gender or sexual politics. Wishful interpretation, I suppose. That's a really wishful interpretation. I think that's a really, you've got to want that interpretation, Wilhelm. But I do think that we can distinguish, and this plays into the notion of J.K. Rowling placing the worst kind of bigotry into the mouths of the Dursleys, right? We are not supposed to believe that the Dursleys are good people. Thus, when she makes them bigoted, when she makes them prejudiced, then she is demonstrating how undesirable those qualities and traits are. This kind of latent early 2000s homophobia, this casual, I suppose is what I mean, right? This casual and constant early 2000s homophobia from Dudley is entirely appropriate, right? That is not inconceivable for a character of his type, particularly at that time, and I dare say not today either. We still have a distance to go, you guys. But by putting that casual homophobia on Dudley, she is already making the case that this is not acceptable. She is already making the case that it is undesirable, that it ought to be mocked, that we are not allowed to mistake this as an appropriate response or an appropriate rejoinder from Dudley to Harry. That line about your boyfriend actually stands out to me more significantly because it is obviously directly targeted at notions of love and relationships and sexuality, something that the Harry Potter series as a whole is generally a little sensitive about, generally a little soft about, I suppose. It stands out that it is so casual in that moment, which I think also plays into the idea that we are bespeaking this kind of prejudice, bespeaking this kind of awfulness. Leo Bill is asking, why did the Dementors go there? Spoilers, we'll come back around to that in due course. Yes. And the boyfriend comment says Jackie sounds pretty typical of a bully, right? Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Yes, good. God, there's so much brilliance in the chat. You guys are fantastic. Elbreth herself is pointing out that adolescents don't mature in one go. They go back and forth between mature and immature, often from 1 minute to another, or that's been my experience. Elbreth, I think you're absolutely right. That is, I think we talked about this in the context of Goblet of Fire, didn't we? That the progression from immaturity to maturity is not a smooth line, and it certainly isn't, like a rising non-linear curve. What would you call that? Like an exponential curve, I suppose. It's been a while. I did my math at the beginning of the podcast and I've let it all fall out of my brain at this point. It is not an exponential curve, and it certainly isn't a linear progression either. It is this sawtooth, jagged and inconsistent approach to maturity, to adulthood, to a full and sophisticated personhood, I suppose. Yeah, so we want to be careful too about how we track some of our other characters here too. Ryan is saying here in the chat, whoops, it just scrolled, so now I'm not sure what Ryan was saying. Here it is. Ryan says, Harry is a textbook case of a soldier whose mind is at war, but who has to go about life like nothing's different and is told daily there is no war, but he knows that it is out there. He's always ready for a fight and takes every opportunity to start one, which is why the angst tapers off once the DA subplot begins. He has started fighting. Ryan, I think that observation about the DA subplot in particular is very, very astute. I think you've absolutely hit the point in the book at which we start to arc out of this, and I think you're absolutely right about the reasons. Obviously, I've made my argument, or made the beginnings of my argument about Voldemort's intrusion, but that is not to discount exactly what you've said. You're completely right. This disassociation between worlds, this disassociation of experience, to go from facing Voldemort at Little Hangleton, to be transferred back to be portkeyed back to Hogwarts, to have the conversation with Cornelius Fudge about how impossible it is that Voldemort has returned, to see this lie persist and to even gain power, to gain significance as we move forward. Yeah, it's really tough. So I can completely see that dissonance there. It's certainly going to be difficult to for Harry to process. Certainly Recyclops is saying, I'm 36, I'm like 76% grown up. I am 40 years old, and I don't know, today's been a pretty good day. I'm feeling like maybe 85% grown up. I cannot make any promises about tomorrow, you guys. I cannot promise that tomorrow I won't watch cartoons and play video games. And they say there's a crisis in modern masculinity. Let's keep pushing on. Of course, we're anticipating the response of the Dementors here. We're anticipating the arrival of the Dementors. A couple of things that we really do want to call out. For a split second, Harry thought he had done magic without meaning to, despite the fact he'd been resisting as hard as he could. He had been resisting the urge to do magic. Harry at war with himself. This is going to be a significant figure of speech and almost like a significant psychological construction as we move through at least the first half of this book. Harry fighting his own desire, fighting his own quote-unquote nature is going to be significant, and here we get an example of that. But he didn't have the power to turn off the stars. He turned his head this way and that, trying to see something, but the darkness pressed on his eyes like a weightless veil. That's just a significant word. I can't go into this anymore for those of you who have not yet finished your reread of Order of the Phoenix or your initial read of Order of the Phoenix, but veil is a very significant word. Much, much more on that later, because now we have to get to the Dementors themselves. There was a horrible, squealing yell, and Dudley's footsteps stopped. At the same moment, Harry felt a creeping chill behind him that could mean only one thing. There was more than one. Dudley, keep your mouth shut! Whatever you do, keep your mouth shut! Wand! Harry muttered frantically, his hands flying over the ground like spiders. Where's Wand? Come on, Lumos! He set the spell automatically, desperate for light to help him in his search, and to his disbelieving relief, light flared inches from his right hand. The wand tip had ignited. Harry snatched it up, scrambled to his feet, and turned around. His stomach turned over. A towering, hooded figure was gliding smoothly toward him, hovering over the ground, no feet nor face visible beneath its robes, sucking on the night as it came. Stumbling backward, Harry raised his wand. Expecto Patronum! A silvery wisp of vapor shot from the tip of the wand, and the Dementor slowed, but the spell hadn't worked properly. Tripping over his feet, Harry retreated further as the Dementor bore down upon him, panic fogging his brain. Concentrate! A pair of grey, slimy, scabbed hands slid from inside the Dementor's robes, reaching for him. A rushing noise filled Harry's ears. Expecto Patronum! His voice sounded dim and distant. Another wisp of silver smoke, feebler than the last, drifted from the wand. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't work the spell. There was laughter inside his own head. Shrill, high-pitched laughter. He could smell the Dementor's putrid, death-cold breath filling his own lungs, drowning him. Think, something happy. But there was no happiness in him. The Dementor's icy fingers were closing on his throat. The high-pitched laughter was growing louder and louder, and a voice spoke inside his head. Bow to death, Harry. It might even be painless. I would not know. I have never died. He was never going to see Ron and Hermione again, and their faces burst clearly into his mind as he fought for breath. Expecto Patronum! Third time's the charm. Third time's the charm, you guys. Echoing the third time's a charm, motif of Harry facing off against the Dementors, right? The rule of threes is in fullest effect when Harry is facing down Dementors. Head back for that. Yeah, the presence of Voldemort is at least as interesting as the presence of the Dementors, right? The presence of the Dementors, the first time that you read this book, is striking, is incredibly powerful. It is impossible that Dementors be here in Little Whinging. It is impossible that the wizard world has so forcibly violated the barrier, the border between the wizarding world and the Muggle world. We've talked about the inversion of that relationship from the first and second books into the third and fourth books, right? That in the first two books, the Wizarding world is quiet and sequestered and protected. In the third and fourth books, it is the Muggle world that is quiet and sequestered and protected. That is now more true than ever. This is an act of outright aggression. This is an unthinkable act of war between the Wizarding world and the Muggle world. We will come back, of course, to the Dementors. We can recognize here the brilliance of J.K. Rowling's prose, the evocation of that powerful cold, that disheartening effect of the presence of the Dementors, the hopelessness, right? There was no happiness in him. The Dementor's icy fingers were closing on his throat. The high-pitched laughter was growing louder and louder, and a voice spoke inside his head. This is not, by the way, a common feature of Dementor assaults or Dementor attacks. It is not likely that, Barty Crouch Jr. in his final moments heard the voice of Voldemort as he was being kissed by the Dementor at the end of Goblet of Fire, off panel, of course, off page, but still, it happened. It is unlikely that Barty Crouch Jr. experienced this because this is happening within Harry. This is another example, I would argue, another piece of evidence in the wall that we are building, in the foundation that we are building to support the edifice of speculation in which we are all engaged here. There was no happiness in him. The Dementor's icy fingers were closing on his throat. The high-pitched laughter was growing louder and louder, and a voice spoke inside his head. Bow to death, Harry. It might even be painless. I would not know. I have never died. There's no question, of course, that is Voldemort. The high-pitched laughter is enough, but the I have never died, all the proof that we need. He was never going to see Ron and Hermione again, and their faces burst clearly into his mind as he fought for breath. Expecto Patronum. It is perhaps surprising that Harry, in his struggle to think of happy things, in his struggle to think of things that fill him with joy and that fierce defiance of hope that charge the Expecto Patronum charm, right? It is surprising, perhaps, that it takes him that long to think of Ron and Hermione, to think of his best friends in the world. He is now so distant from himself, he is so separated from his core identity, so separated from his core nature, that he is unable to think, I suppose, of like the most obvious Harry Potter 101. Like the first line of Harry Potter's biography reads, well, he was the boy who lived. Second line reads, he was super good friends with Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley, right? That is the obvious go-to point of reference for happy thoughts as far as Harry is concerned, and it takes him so long. Rahit is saying, why is this specific quote occurring to Harry though? Bow to death, I've never died. Harry knows that the worst case scenario, he's not dying. That's not what Dementors do. Why the odd connection here? Well, it's not all that Dementors do. We don't know what the Dementors are going to do to Harry, right? They can kiss him and apparently suck out his soul, whatever that means within the cosmology of Harry Potter, whatever that means within the theology of Harry Potter. We're still not sure about the metaphysics with regard to sucking out the soul. Sucking out the identity seems to be the case, right? Rendering inert and without identity is very much like, or is philosophically akin to, sucking out the soul from a person. That certainly seems to be true of Barty Crouch Jr., of course. Is that death? Would death represent, or would death be an appropriate word to use for that? Well, kind of, in a way, it is the death of self. It is the death of identity. It is the death of personhood. It's not a physical death, which is certainly what Voldemort is referring to, we can infer, right? That is the kind of death that he has not suffered, right? He has suffered a physical death. He has not suffered the kind of death of self that we would usually associate with the Dementor's kiss. It's difficult to be sure, but we don't know what the Dementors are tasked with. We don't know why it is that they are pursuing Harry at this point. Good. All right. Let's keep pushing on. So much to get through, you guys. So much to get through. But of course, the last Expecto Patronum charm works. The vision of Ron and Hermione in Harry's mind is enough to charge the charm to summon the stag, his Patronus. And then we get Arabella Figg, which is just pretty great. What? Said Harry blankly. He left, said Mrs. Figg, wringing her hands. Left to see someone about a batch of cauldrons that fell off the back of a broom. I told him I'd flay him alive if he went, and now look, Dementors. I'm just lucky I put Mr. Tibbies on the case, but we haven't got time to stand around. Hurry, now, we've got to get you back. Oh, the trouble this is going to cause. I will kill him. But the revelation that his batty old cat-obsessed neighbour knew what Dementors were was almost as big of a shock to Harry as meeting two of them down the alleyway. You're a witch. I'm a squib, as Mundungus knows full well, so how on earth was I supposed to help you fight off Dementors? He left you completely without cover when I warned him. This bloke, Mundungus, has been following me. Hang on, it was him. He disapparated from the front of my house? Yes, but luckily I'd stationed Mr. Tibbies under a car just in case, and Mr. Tibbies came and warned me, but by the time I got to your house, he'd gone, and now, oh, what's Dumbledore going to say? You! She shrieked at Dudley, still supine on the alley floor. Get your fat bottom off the ground, quick! You know Dumbledore, said Harry, staring at her. Of course I know Dumbledore. Who doesn't know Dumbledore? But come on, I'll be no help if they come back. I've never so much as transfigured a tea bag. She stood up, seized one of Dudley's massive arms in her wizened hands, and tugged. Get up, you useless lump, get up! But Dudley either could not or would not move. He was still on the ground, trembling and ashen-faced, his mouth shut very tight. Let's take a very brief tangent here. It is going to be a good long time before we get back to Dudley Dursley. It is going to be a good long time before we see really the consequence of tonight. J.K. Rowling has asserted in extra-textual material that what Dudley saw when he was facing the Dementor was himself. That he was revealed to himself in all of his grotesquerie, in all of his awfulness, in all of his venality, in all of his pride, in all of his bullying, swaggering, unearned aggression, in all of his spoiled and self-indulgent weakness. For all that Dudley is, Dudley beheld that, I suppose, is what I'm saying. That at least is J.K. Rowling's assertion. I find that very convincing. I find that very compelling. What is Dudley most afraid of in the world? Like, what is the worst thing that can face Dudley? What is the thing that would drain all hope of Dudley? Well, it's Dudley, because here is a person whose identity, thanks to the forcible intrusion, thanks to the outright manipulation and cruel domination of his parents, Dudley is a facsimile of a person. He is a hollow gourd. He is a nothing of an individual, right? He is just pomp and puff and nothing else. The revelation of that is, of course, going to be enormously powerful for Dudley, and maybe in the books to come we will see some kind of transition there. That is pretty much all that we can do here. Yes, we're talking about the fat shaming. Yes, in all of his blatant homophobia, says Clambert. Yes, absolutely. But we're getting into the Alexandria saying always with the fat shaming. Dudley sucks though. Yeah, no, he really does. Like, he really does. But yeah. The fat shaming is a little bit much from JKR as we move through. So here we get Arabella Figg. In fact, we're going to move right on to the next slide because I want to talk about Arabella Figg. I want to talk about her previous appearances here because, of course, as I noted back at the end of Goblet of Fire, this is not the first mention that we've had of Mrs. Arabella Figg. This from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Petunia and Vernon talking to each other, of course. Bad news, Vernon, she said. Mrs. Figg's broken a leg. She can't take him. She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day to adventure parks and hamburger restaurants or the movies. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Figg, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets away. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Figg made him look at photographs of all the cats she'd ever owned. Now what? Said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he'd planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Figg had broken her leg, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself that it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibby's snowy Mr. Paws and Tufty again. Chapter 2 of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. That is how long Mrs. Figg has been in the continuity, in the canon of Harry Potter. It's really quite lovely, I have to say. I do not think that this was intended back when JKR created Arabella Figg, or created Mrs. Figg, as it was back in the first book, but very lovely all the same. Very lovely all the same. Then we get another reference in, not a reference to Arabella Figg, of course, but rather a reference to Mundungus Fletcher. Mundungus is a brilliant kind of, what is that, 16th, 17th century? I may be even post-dating that. I should have written down this note, but I was assured that I would remember it. A 16th century word meaning kind of foul and odious tobacco, like a really foul-smelling tobacco is mundungus. It comes from comes into English from the Spanish, but a really effective bit of naming from J.K. Rowling at this point. So from chapter 3 of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, skipping ahead a whole book into book 2, Mr. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man, going bald, but the little hair he had was as red as any of his children's. He was wearing long green robes which were dusty and travel-worn. "What a night," he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat down around him. 9 raids! 9! And old Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. First reference to Mundungus Fletcher, of course, who also crops up again at the beginning of Goblet of Fire in Chapter 10. Percy Weasley, his father's son constantly. Percy Weasley also has a thought about Mundungus Fletcher. "Complaining about security at the World Cup," said Percy. "They want compensation for the ruined property. Mundungus Fletcher's put in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with an ensuite jacuzzi, but I've got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a cloak propped on sticks." Mundungus Fletcher, we're getting a sense of this guy here. He is the kind of person who ought to be raided, the kind of person who would hex a representative of the Ministry of Magic when his back is turned, the kind of guy who would file compensation for ruined property, claiming a 12-bedroom tent with an ensuite jacuzzi, even though he was sleeping under a cloak propped on sticks. And then, of course, in chapter 36 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, we get the pull together. We get these characters introduced within their proper context. "That will be enough to be going on with," said Dumbledore, stepping between them once more. "Now I have work for each of you. Fudge's attitude, though not unexpected, changes everything. Sirius, I need you to set off at once. You are to alert Remus Lupin, Arabella Figg, Mundungus Fletcher, the old crowd. Lie low at Lupin's for a while. I will contact you there." Joseph Shannon giving us another alternate title for this book, Mundungus Fletcher and the Egregious Insurance Fraud. I suppose not this book, the previous book in the series, yes. That's very good, that's very good. Nikki is asking, did Mundungus ever actually do anything of importance in the aid of the Order of the Phoenix? Seems to be there to mess things up. He's a little complicated. We're going to have a better opportunity to talk about him, but yes, it's a little complicated. And Alexandria is saying, I hate Mundungus so much, he gets in the way constantly. Yes, I do think there's some intentionality surrounding that. Well, we'll have the opportunity to talk about him in a couple of weeks' time, I guess, when we get there. Okay, let me check in on the chat. Is Sarah having trouble? I've been searching on YouTube for Budgerigar surfing with no luck, says Sarah. I'm terribly sorry for that. That is exactly the kind of harmless puff like human interest piece that you would get at the end of the 7 o'clock news. It's very cute that Vernon and Petunia are watching the 7 o'clock news, and that's the news that Harry is listening in on, of course, because the 7 o'clock news traditionally in Britain is pretty lightweight anyway. Like it's not terribly prying or acute, I suppose. Let me see here. Good. Okay. All right, we're all up to date. Let's continue. Moving on. So this is our introduction to Arabella Figg and to Mundungus Fletcher, and this is representative, I think, of the kind of expansion of world building that JKR is doing in the context of Order of the Phoenix. We've had some of this in Goblet, a little bit of this in Prisoner of Azkaban, of course, but this is the point at which she is thinking primarily, I think, about the series. She is thinking primarily about the saga. What we've had before, up to the end of Goblet of Fire, these are standalone adventures. In fact, it is part of the narrative construction of Goblet of Fire that we are supposed to expect an episodic adventure. We're supposed to anticipate that this book will reset everyone back to their initial positions before we conclude the school year for Harry, in pretty much the same way as we have in the course of the first 3 books, of course. So this is a subversion of our expectations in Book 4, but in the 3-year gap between Book 4 and Book 5, JKR's sense of her fictional world, sense of her narrative frame, sense of her tone and her register, and sense of her own ambition, and I would probably argue capability, has clearly expanded. This is a much bigger book in every conceivable sense. Like in every dimension, this is a bigger book than any of the preceding books. In some senses, a bigger book than all of the preceding books put together, but it is also much more concerned with its position in the series and with arcing toward a final satisfying conclusion for Harry's entire Hogwarts experience than it is in telling a self-contained story. That is going to be true of Order of the Phoenix, that is going to be true of Half-Blood Prince, that is going to be true ultimately of Deathly Hallows too. Yeah. Good. All right. Let's continue onward here. Another little note here too, right? We get the reference to squibs here from Mrs. Figg. There are, of course, 2 prominent squibs in Harry Potter. Two kind of like named and significant squibs in Harry Potter. One is Arabella Figg and the other is Argus Filch. They have exactly the same initials and they both notably love cats. Coincidence? Maybe not. But if you don't want your kid to be a squib, be sure not to give them the initials AF. That is the advice that I can give to you. And if you can dissuade them from cats too, then hey, everyone wins, I guess. Everyone wins. All right, let's keep pushing onward here. Harry, you don't understand. I'm sorry, this is my Arabella Figg voice. Harry, you don't understand. Dumbledore will need to act as quickly as possible. The Ministry will have their own ways of detecting underage magic. They'll know already. You mark my words. But I was getting rid of Dementors. I had to use magic. They're going to be more worried what Dementors were doing floating around Wisteria Walk, surely. Oh, my dear, I wish it were so, but I'm afraid. Mundungus Fletcher, I'm going to kill you. There was a loud crack, and a strong smell of mingled drink and stale tobacco filled the air as a squat, unshaven man in a tattered overcoat materialized right in front of them. He had short, bandy legs, long, straggly ginger hair, and bloodshot, baggy eyes that gave him the doleful look of a basset hound. He was also clutching a silvery bundle that Harry recognized at once as an invisibility cloak. "Sup, Figgy?" he said, staring at Mrs. Figg, to Harry, to Dudley. "What happened to staying under cover?" "I'll give you under cover," cried Mrs. Figg. "Dementors, you useless, skiving sneak thief!" "Dementors?" repeated Mundungus, aghast. "Dementors here?" "Yes, here, you worthless pile of bat droppings, here!" shrieked Mrs. Figg. "Dementors attacking the boy on your watch!" "Blimey," said Mundungus weakly, looking from Mrs. Figg to Harry and back again. "Blimey, and you were off buying stolen cauldrons, didn't I tell you not to go, didn't I?" Mundungus looked deeply uncomfortable. It was a very good business opportunity, see?" Mrs. Figg raised the arm from which her string bag dangled and whacked Mundungus around the face and neck with it. Judging by the clanking noise, it was full of cat food. "Ouch! Get off, you mad old bat! Someone's going to tell Dumbledore!" "Yes, they have!" yelled Mrs. Figg, still swinging the bag of cat food at every bit of Mundungus she could reach. "And it had better be you, and you can tell him why you weren't there to help." "Keep your hair on," said Mundungus, his arms over his head, cowering. I'm going! And with another loud crack, he vanished. Nicky saying, "I question Mundungus's definition of undercover." Yes, no, exactly. What happened to staying undercover? Just disappearing from right outside his voice. Yes, right outside Harry's house. Yes. Al's been saying, "I like how Jim Dale reads Mundungus is totally hammered here." No, me too. It's that scent of tobacco, right? The Mundungus of it all, and the alcohol too, is just a great combination. Just a really great bit of characterization. And as Joseph says, in Mundungus's defense, Figgy is a pretty solid nickname. I completely agree. Like Figgy, Arabella Figgy Fig, I just kind of want her to be more significant. I just kind of want her to be like, I don't know, can we discover that she's not a squib and have her just be a professor of, I don't know, something cute and adorable? Yeah. MC Figgy Fig, says prisoner AB234. Yes, MC Figgy Fig, rocking the mic. That's exactly it. And rocking the bag of cat food around Mundungus Fletcher's head there too. Let's, I'm looking nervously at the clock and thinking that there's no way we're going to get through our slides. We can't be behind after one session. That is going to set a very bad precedent for the rest of the series, you guys. Let's return, though, to number 4, Privet Drive. The hall light was on. Harry stuck his wand back inside the waistband of his jeans, rang the bell, and watched Aunt Petunia's outline grow larger and larger, oddly distorted by the rippling glass in the front door. "Diddy! About time, too. I was getting quite... Diddy, what's the matter?" Harry looked sideways at Dudley and ducked out from under his arm just in time. Dudley swayed for a moment on the spot, his face pale green, and then he opened his mouth at last and vomited all over the doormat. Diddy, what's the matter with you? Vernon! Harry's uncle came galumphing out of the living room, walrus mustache blowing hither and thither as it always did when he was agitated. He hurried forward to help Aunt Petunia negotiate a weak-kneed Dudley over the threshold while avoiding stepping in the pool of sick. "He's ill, Vernon." "What is it, son? What's happened? Did Mr. Polkiss give you something foreign for tea?" "Why are you all covered in dirt, darling? Have you been lying on the ground?" "Hang on, you haven't been mugged, have you, son?" Aunt Petunia screamed. "Phone the police, Vernon, phone the police! Diddy, darling, speak to Mummy. What did they do to you?" In all the kerfuffle, no one seemed to have noticed Harry, which suited him perfectly. He managed to slip inside just before Uncle Vernon slammed the door, and while the Dursleys made their noisy progress down the hall toward the kitchen, Harry moved carefully and quietly toward the stairs. "Who did it, son? Give us names. We'll get them, don't worry." "Shush! He's trying to say something, Vernon. What is it, Diddy? Tell Mummy." Harry's foot was on the bottommost stair when Dudley found his voice. "Him!" Harry froze, foot on the stair, face screwed up, braced for the explosion. Rohit calling out the line here, yes. Did Mrs. Polkiss give you something foreign for tea? Leave it to these isolated, close-minded, lawn-obsessed suburbanites to blame everything on foreigners. Yes, exactly right. That's the first thought. Not just the first thought, of an awful, xenophobic, close-minded, small-minded, petty, suburbanite, to borrow Ruhit's word there. Absolutely, that is going to be the first thought. But of course, that is going to be the thought that Vernon Dursley goes to before any other thought. And again, we're back to kind of issues tangential to JKR's use of weight as an indicator of virtue and valor in the Harry Potter universe. Of course, it's going to be food. Of course, he's going to think of food first. It's just awful. Yeah, Rohit clarifying, suburbanites not necessarily bad. I live in the suburbs. Yes, no. I think I would distinguish between people who live in the suburbs and suburbanites, right? Like, I understand that it is denotatively specific in that regard, but it is connotatively very different. I think that, yes, I think suburbanite is an appropriate word in this instance. Molly's saying, what a creepy experience for Dudley, something invisible sucking out his soul. I know, it's, again, we're going to have the opportunity. I promise you, we're going to have the opportunity to circle back around to Dudley and to give him something of a satisfying emotional arc, I think, by the time that we get to the end of the series. But yeah, Clambert saying, God, imagine if Lily had married a foreign wizard. Well, I think that's part of it. I mean, yes, you're right. That would have been so much worse, right? That would have been just the cherry on top for Vernon Dursley and for Petunia too, in terms of their contempt, right? More even than their outrage, but their contempt in that regard. But I think that is part of the issue, is that foreign people are not like us, right? Gay people, to kind of borrow Dudley's homophobia and put it in the mouth of Vernon Dursley, which I have no problem with at all. I am very confident that he would share his son's notions in that regard. They're not like us. Wizards are not like us. That is the real crux of Dursley-ish bigotry. That is the real crux of Dursley-ish prejudice. It's not against a specific group. It is against every conceivable group that is not like us. And what is it that keeps society functioning? What is it that keeps us like us? Well, it is constant vigilance, as Alistair Mad-Eye Moody might say, right? It is the constant vigilance of the neighborhood and the community. We're going to hit this drum pretty hard at the end of the chapter when we get to the slide from which I took the title of this week's session, which means that I absolutely have to get through all of the slides. Let's keep pushing onward here to the letter from Mafalda Hopkirk. But Harry was already ripping open the envelope and pulling out the letter inside, his heart pounding somewhere in the region of his Adam's apple. Dear Mr. Potter, we have received intelligence that you performed the Patronus charm at 9:23 this evening on a Muggle-inhabited area in the presence of a Muggle. The severity of this breach and the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery has resulted in your expulsion from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Ministry representatives will be calling at your place of residence shortly to destroy your wand. As you've already received an official warning for a previous offence under Section 13 of the International Confederation of Wizards Statute of Secrecy, we regret to inform you that your presence is required at a disciplinary hearing at the Ministry of Magic at 9 a.m. on August 12th. Hoping you are well, yours sincerely, Mafalda Hopkirk, Improper Use of Magic Office, the Ministry of Magic. Harry read the letter through twice. He was only vaguely aware of Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia talking in the vicinity. Inside his head, all was icy and numb. One fact had penetrated his consciousness like a paralyzing dart. He was expelled from Hogwarts. It was all over. He was never going back. Inside his head, all was icy and numb. Here we are seeing the manifestation of hopelessness, right? Hopelessness has seized him. It is like the influence of the Dementor. The Dementors are not generating this icy cold, this cold of despair and hopelessness. They are generating it in the sense that they are causing it, but this is not a connection that is without precedent in the world of Harry Potter. This seems to be emotionally true for Harry Potter. Yes. Wilhelm Scream saying, this is a really interesting observation. On the other hand, I have thought that many times what a missed opportunity, what a shame, cultural development over the past couple of decades, that JKR didn't choose to make Harry Potter a person of colour. It's understandable that she didn't, and the series unfortunately may not have had the same impact, but still in retrospect it can be seen as a kind of missed opportunity. I think that's very true. I think that's, yes, I mean, though we can get to questions of colorblind casting and genderblind casting and you know, those questions associated with the broader world of Harry Potter. Does Harry Potter read differently if Harry Potter is, and I'm thinking in particular of a suburban English experience here, right? Does Harry Potter read differently if Harry is ethnically from the Indian subcontinent, for example, or from, you know, the Caribbean, for example? The answer is yes. And the answer is that it is much less convincing. You cannot, I think, within the frame of a story like this, which is about a specific experience, it is an experience which is universalizable, I suppose, right? We can find the applicability within Harry's adolescent experience, but it is still the adolescent experience of a pretty privileged white kid in suburbia, right? It would be weird to read Harry Potter as it is and simply to change his ethnicity, simply to change his race, simply to change the context of this character in exactly the same way as it would be impossible, I think, to simply and trivially gender flip Harry Potter, right? You cannot simply go through, do a find and replace in the manuscript of Harry Potter and change all of Harry's pronouns from he to her. It would be disingenuous to do so, because to do so would be to suggest that a young woman in Harry's position would have exactly the same experience as Harry has had. And that is just untrue, right? She may be possessed of the same valor. She may be possessed of exactly the same personality. She may accomplish exactly the same things, but the context would be very different. Harry is a white boy going through these experiences, and that is understood in every action that he has, every interaction that he has, every response that he faces. So while I think, I mean, obviously, to claw this back, Wilhelm, I realized that was not the point that you were making, right? I realized that was not the argument that you were making. It was that we could just trivially tweak it. We could just trivially change it and it would be fine. I'm very interested in the idea of, in particular, I'm thinking, of course, about Hermione. I'm thinking about colorblind casting. I think that's very significant. I do not think that... Well, I don't think that the core texts are just specific enough about Hermione's experience that we can say for sure that the colorblind casting there was, or I guess not colorblind casting, right? Because it is now J.K. Rowling's assertion that Hermione was always black, which, again, as I've said before, would be more convincing if not for the fact that apparently every black character in Harry Potter is identified as a black character, right? Like that is a common motif in J.K. Rowling's early novels in particular. I think she kind of shakes that off as we move forward a little bit, but yeah. Enough of that though for now. Let's keep pushing. Oh, yeah, exactly. Brendan saying if Harry were a girl, we would get a scene in the girls' dorm. Just think Hermione would be able to tell Harry all the answers that much quicker. Harry had to be a boy to slow down the narrative. Wow, you know what? In a number of ways, that is absolutely true. Rahit saying, I'm a young guy of color. My parents are from India, and only very recently did I realize how white this whole series is. I wish there were more characters of color. While I agree with Alistair that colorblind casting might not line up with the actual text here, I hope that any future adaptation of Harry Potter does cast more people of color in traditionally white roles. With that, Rahit, you and I are in complete agreement. I absolutely want more diversity in the world of Harry Potter. And 15 years from now, when we decide to remake Harry Potter, right, when we start over with Philosopher's Stone and we go through the movie series again, what I really want is, more diversity, more representation. Make Harry from Southeast Asia, make Ron black. Right? There are innumerable ways that we can approach this. In the spirit of adaptation. We can't transplant the text literally, but we can adapt the text, and I would argue ought to adapt the text. Because while there are specifics in Harry's experience which speak to him being a white boy, right? I do not think that those experiences are necessary for the arc of Harry Potter as a story. I think that we could have this story altered in exactly those ways. We really must keep pushing onward. We must push on, in fact, to talk about Mafalda Hopkirk. You might remember back when we were discussing Goblet of Fire, I discussed very early, I think around the time that Rita Skeeter was introduced into that story, that Rita Skeeter was not the original character who was supposed to fulfill that role. Rita Skeeter was actually edited in after the fact to Goblet of Fire, because originally the interaction with the Fourth Estate throughout Goblet of Fire was supposed to take place through the medium of a school newspaper, which would be written by a Slytherin girl named Mafalda, right? But we are recycling the name Mafalda even there because Mafalda Hopkirk has already appeared, of course. Let me call up the quote from Chamber of Secrets. This, in fact, is the letter that Harry received back in Chamber of Secrets after Dobby had levitated the dessert. Dear Mr. Potter, we have received intelligence that a hover charm was used at your place of residence this evening at 12 minutes past 9. As you know, underage wizards are not permitted to perform spells outside school, and further spell work on your part may lead to expulsion from said school. Decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, 1875, paragraph C. We would also ask you to remember that any magical activity that risks notice by members of the non-magical community, muggles, is a serious offence under Section 13 of the International Confederation of Warlocks Statute of Secrecy. Enjoy your holidays. Yours sincerely, Mafalda Hopkirk, Improper Use of Magic Office, Ministry of Magic. Chapter 2 of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets there. This is Mafalda's gig, right? Mafalda Hopkirk just gets to hang out and write these letters, or auto-generate, like mail merge these letters, I suppose, pretty much all day, every day. We will, of course, catch up with Mafalda in Deathly Hallows. I should say Mafalda is, actually, it's a really interesting name, so I went looking into the etymology of the name. Mafalda is the Portuguese form of Matilda, which means strength in battle or mighty sword, right? This comes from the German Macht and Hild, right? From might and power and battle or sword. Macht and Hild gives us Matilda, which gives us Mafalda when we transliterate that into the Portuguese, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. As I say, excuse me, Mafalda will show up again in Deathly Hallows. Yeah. Let me see. Yes. Jackie saying she must write a lot of letters. Yes. No kidding. Good. Yeah, there's a lot of chat here in the chat. Of course, where else would the chat be about race and issues of diversity and representation in the context of Harry Potter? Stay tuned for an upcoming episode of Dear Mr. Potter. I am trying to put together the long-promised roundtable discussion about, well, not necessarily just about race and representation, but just about diverse voices responding to Harry Potter, I suppose. So stay tuned for that in the very near future. Good. Alispin is recommending a podcast, which, please, I know nothing about this. Yes. Okay. Corporeal says one day the chat will revolt, escape, and take over the slides. You guys, if it's not happening tonight, it is probably never going to happen. But, also wouldn't be too bad. Wouldn't be too bad if that were to happen. So this is Mafalda Hopkirk, and this is Harry's threat, right? He has been expelled from Hogwarts. Don't worry, we're going to claw that back. We're going to get our letter from Arthur. This is the second of 5 letters that Harry is going to receive, or that people are going to receive in the course of this relatively short chapter. We get the first letter from Mafalda. We get the letter from Arthur, which you can see on the slide here in front of you. We get another letter from Mafalda saying, actually, having thought about it a little bit, your inquiry, your hearing is going to determine what happens to you. You are suspended, but you don't have to give up your wand. Then we get the letter from Sirius Black, and then we get the enigmatic missive addressed to Petunia right at the end. A resounding crack filled the kitchen. Aunt Petunia screamed, Uncle Vernon yelled and ducked, but for the 3rd time that night, Harry was staring at the source of a disturbance he had not made. He spotted it at once. A dazed and ruffled-looking barn owl was sitting outside of the kitchen sill, having just collided with the closed window. Ignoring Uncle Vernon's anguished yell of, "Owls!" Harry crossed the room at a run and wrenched the window open again. The owl stuck out its leg, to which a small roll of parchment was tied, shook its feathers, and took off the moment Harry had pulled off the letter. Hands shaking, Harry unfurled the second message, which was written very hastily and blotchily in black ink. Harry, Dumbledore's just arrived at the Ministry, and he's trying to sort it all out. Do not leave your aunt and uncle's house. Do not do any more magic. Do not surrender your wand. Arthur Weasley. Dumbledore was trying to sort it all out. What did that mean? How much power did Dumbledore have to override the Ministry of Magic? Was there a chance he might be allowed back to Hogwarts then? A small shoot of hope burgeoned in Harry's chest, almost immediately strangled by panic. How was he supposed to refuse to surrender his wand without doing magic? He'd have to duel with the Ministry representatives, and if he did that, he'd be lucky to escape Azkaban, let alone expulsion. Again, how was he supposed to surrender his wand without doing magic? Or how was he supposed to refuse to surrender his wand without doing magic? Harry's first thought here is of violence. His first thought in response to Mafalda's initial letter, in fact, when he has been expelled from Hogwarts, after the panic has begun to clear in his breast, his first thought is, surrender my wand? No way. I'm going to have to run for it. I'm going to have to just flee. I am done. I am not obeying the instructions that have been sent to me here. This is a quality of rebellion, which in Harry Potter's experience up to this point is usually grounded in some kind of explanation, is usually grounded in some kind of excuse. Let's just call it what it is, right? Harry will have an excuse to do what he wants to do. He will be able to justify it to himself. He can't in this moment, or rather he doesn't in this moment. He rejects outright the notion of surrendering his wand for destruction and decides instead that he's going to flee. Now he's told not to flee, and he's immediately thinking of fighting, of dueling with Ministry representatives. Like, what? Is that really the option? That's the option that presents itself to you here? All they can do is send owls, asks Alispin. Arthur Weasley can't visit Privet Drive in this moment. Well, visiting Privet Drive, as we saw, not as easy as it should otherwise be. But yeah, could he not just show up here in this moment? What is Arthur doing? Dumbledore's just arrived at the Ministry. He's trying to sort it all out. Do not leave your aunt and uncle's house. Do not do any more magic. Do not surrender your wand. Arthur Weasley. I'm inferring from this that Arthur too is at the Ministry, right? But even then, you would expect Dumbledore's just arrived here at the Ministry, perhaps? Yeah, Arthur is reassuring Harry, but events are going to unfold so quickly that we're not really going to have chance to catch up with all of that. Yes, Sarah saying some adult needs to show up. We are desperately in need of some adults up in here. Yes, let's get to the Dursleys here. Dudley at this point is trying to communicate exactly how his experience with the Dementor felt. Excuse me. Felt as if you'd never be happy again, Harry supplied tonelessly. Yes, Dudley whispered, still trembling. So, said Uncle Vernon, voice restored to full and considerable volume as he straightened up. So you put some crackpot spell on my son so he'd hear voices and believe he was doomed to misery or something, did you? How many times do I have to tell you? Said Harry, temper and voice rising together. It wasn't me. It was a couple of Dementors. A couple of, what's this codswallop? Dementors, said Harry slowly and clearly. 2 of them. And what the ruddy hell are Dementors? They guard the wizard prison Azkaban, said Aunt Petunia. 2 seconds ringing silence followed those words, and then Aunt Petunia clapped her hand over her mouth as though she'd let slip a disgusting swear word. Uncle Vernon was goggling at her. Harry's brain reeled. Mrs. Figg was one thing, but Aunt Petunia... How do you know that? He asked her, astonished. Aunt Petunia looked quite appalled with herself. She glanced at Uncle Vernon in fearful apology, then lowered her hand slightly to reveal her horsey teeth. "I heard that awful boy telling her about them years ago," she said jerkily. "If you mean my mum and dad, why don't you use their names?" said Harry loudly, but Aunt Petunia ignored him. She seemed horribly flustered. Harry was stunned. Except for one outburst years ago, in the course of which Aunt Petunia had screamed that Harry's mother had been a freak, he had never heard her mention her sister. He was astounded that she had remembered this scrap of information about the magical world for so long, when she usually put all of her energies into pretending it didn't exist. Uncle Vernon opened his mouth, closed it again, opened it once more, shut it, then apparently struggling to remember how to talk, opened it for a third time and croaked, So... They actually exist, do they, Dementi Whatsits?" Aunt Petunia nodded. Recyclops calling out here, I love how many permutations of Dementi Whatsits Vernon conjures. It's pretty great. And Albereth herself putting it perfectly. Whoa, Petunia! Hey, Petunia, how's your knowledge of the wizarding world? Is it, like, surprisingly deep? I buy Aunt Petunia's appalled response to her own slip of the tongue here. I buy that completely. I have seen some, conspiracy theories online that in fact Petunia has always been more sympathetic to Harry than she has revealed. And in a sense, of course, that is kind of true. This is a spoilery sense. So if you're reading this for the first time and you're not yet caught up with that notion, then don't worry. It's not a huge spoiler, but there is at least some ambiguity to Petunia's relationship with Harry, which is of course going to be suggested by the very end of this chapter, this passage. Yeah, Rohit asking, I wonder why Petunia remembered this random detail. She must have heard a lot about the wizarding world when eavesdropping on spoilers. Yes, but this is the one that stands out. Dementors and Azkaban. Why should this stand out to Petunia? Why should this, if we assume indeed that this one little sliver of knowledge about the wizarding world has been preserved in Aunt Petunia's memory for all these many years, why this one? Why should this stick? Why should this be relevant rather than, well, any one of the proper nouns that we've heard about in our discussion of Harry Potter, right? In our reading of Harry Potter. Why this and not the Whomping Willow? Why? Well, I suppose the Whomping Willow wasn't yet planted. I suppose was planted during that period, but may not have been known about by James and Lily at that point, or at least would not have been a point of speculation in exactly the same way. But why not Grindylows? Why not merfolk? Why not dragons? Why not something? Why Dementors? And why Azkaban? Well, I think that we can unravel this because of Petunia's perspective on the wizarding world. The wizarding world for Petunia at that time, certainly true today too, is corrupt, is distasteful, is disgusting, is freakish, right? We have Harry remembering that previous association between Lily and freakishness as asserted by Petunia. The wizarding world is not to be trusted, that it is not a positive place. What are we going to do with all of these wizards? Well, of course, we're going to lock them up in wizard prison. And if we're hearing about wizard prison, that is certainly going to be a thing that is going to stick in Petunia's head, it seems to me. And if we're thinking about wizard prison, then the guards of wizard prison being faceless monstrosities that devour the soul of the inhabitants and certainly blot out all hope and all sense of purpose and sense of greatness and sense of grandeur, right? All good things come to an end in Azkaban thanks to the Dementors. It seems to me entirely appropriate that would be a detail that would lodge in Petunia's head. That would be a detail that Petunia would think about after the fact in a way that she may not think about the giant spiders in the Forbidden Forest or centaurs or, transfiguration classes or whatever else, right? Brendan saying Petunia is like someone who knows the truth but chooses not to live it. She knows about true magic and denies it. It holds her back from being who she is meant to be. This is such a big theme in the book. Petunia's reaction connects to the Ministry's reaction. It absolutely does. It also connects in another really interesting way. Okay, let me pause there for just a second to lampshade that thought, Brendan, because you are completely right, and I think that is super important. Petunia's response to the wizarding world is exactly the same as the wizarding world's response to Voldemort, right? Inauthenticity and choosing to preserve the status quo, choosing to preserve a facade in opposition to fact and truth and hope and just trying your best and making the world better, right? Choosing to believe that the world is just fine as it is when you are instead called upon to make the world better or to fight a great evil, that is cowardice. That is disingenuous in the extreme. It is corruptive, and it is absolutely what both Petunia and the Ministry are doing. Yes. I also think that there's an interesting point of comparison here between Petunia and Arabella Figg, right? squibs are non-magical people who are spawned of the magical world, right? That is to say that a squib is a non-magical person. A squib is the inverse of a muggle-born wizard, right? A squib is a magical person with no magical power born to an established wizarding family. So practically and functionally, what distinguishes a squib from a muggle? Well, it is only knowledge of the wizarding world. That is it. That is the only thing that distinguishes Arabella Figg from, let's say, Vernon Dursley, right? But the Dursleys, of course, are a special case. Petunia has a partial knowledge of the wizarding world. She is not completely a muggle. She wants to be, very badly wants to be. And it isn't just Harry's presence that is pulling her out of that comfort zone. It is her own knowledge. It is her own awareness. That, I think, is why she is so disgusted with herself. Aunt Petunia clapped her hand over her mouth as though she had let slip a disgusting swear word. Aunt Vernon was goggling at her. Harry's brain reeled, right? This is Petunia violating her own sense of her identity, right? This is a complete betrayal of who she is, like a very fundamental sense. Let's push on. We've got, what have we got? We've got 2 more slides. We've got to do Lord Voldemort, of course. Lord Voldemort, said Harry. He registered dimly how strange it was that the Dursleys, who flinched, winced, and squawked if they heard words like wizard, magic, or wand, could hear the name of the most evil wizard of all time without the slightest tremor. Lord, hang on, said Uncle Vernon, his face screwed up, a look of dawning comprehension in his piggy eyes. I've heard that name. That was the one who murdered my parents. Yes, Harry said. But he's gone, said Uncle Vernon impatiently, without the slightest sign that the murder of Harry's parents might have been a painful topic to anybody. That giant bloke said so. He's gone. He's back, said Harry heavily. It felt very strange to be standing there in Aunt Petunia's surgically clean kitchen, beside the top-of-the-range fridge and the widescreen television, and talking calmly of Lord Voldemort to Uncle Vernon. The arrival of the Dementors in Little Whinging seemed to have caused a breach in the great invisible wall that divided the relentlessly non-magical world of Privet Drive and the world beyond. Harry's 2 lives had somehow become fused, and everything had been turned upside down. The Dursleys were asking for details about the magical world, and Mrs. Figg knew Albus Dumbledore. Dementors were soaring around Little Whinging, and he might never go back to Hogwarts. Harry's head throbbed more painfully. Back, whispered Aunt Petunia. She was looking at Harry as she had never looked at him before, and all of a sudden, for the very first time in his life, Harry fully appreciated that Aunt Petunia was his mother's sister. He could not have said why this hit him so very powerfully at this moment. All he knew was that he was not the only person in the room who had an inkling of what Lord Voldemort being back might mean. Aunt Petunia had never in her life looked at him like that before. Her large, pale eyes, so unlike her sister's, were not narrowed in dislike or anger. They were wide and fearful. The furious pretense that Aunt Petunia had maintained all Harry's life, that there was no magic and no world other than the world she inhabited with Uncle Vernon, seemed to have fallen away. Yes, Harry said, talking directly to Aunt Petunia now. He came back a month ago. I saw him. Her hands found Dudley's massive leather-clad shoulders and clutched them. It's hard not to be moved by Petunia Dursley here, honestly, right? It's hard not to feel a spark, a pang of empathy for this woman who is caught up in a much larger world. But Harry, as is his way, has completely encapsulated the conceptual conflict that is now playing out in his life. His 2 lives, his 2 worlds, have crashed into each other. That is happening pretty damn comprehensively, right? The most obvious example of that, the Dementors showing up in Little Whinging, like really, really powerful. The second most obvious, Mrs. Figg is a squib. The third most obvious, Aunt Petunia knows a lot more about the wizarding world. She knows about Azkaban, she knows about Dementors, and she knows about Lord Voldemort. And even now, Uncle Vernon Dursley is asking about Voldemort, is trying to get more information about the wizarding world, is making casual reference to Hagrid, for crying out loud. This is unprecedented. The wall between the worlds is coming down. But that is because there was never a real wall between the worlds. There was never anything that actually prevented magic from coming to Privet Drive. There was never anything that prevented Petunia from knowing about Azkaban and knowing about Dementors. The only thing that has maintained this separation between the Muggle world and the Wizarding world has been, well, conventional wisdom, I suppose. It has been consensus. What we have decided is true. The people in the Muggle world have decided that they don't believe in magic. Vernon Dursley and Aunt Petunia, I think it's weird that I always refer to him as Vernon Dursley and her as Aunt Petunia, right? Vernon and Petunia Dursley have I think it's because I don't want to give him the honorific of uncle, because there is nothing avuncular about Vernon is the deal, but there is something, I don't know what the aunt version of avuncular is, but there is something auntish about Petunia in certain moments, particularly in this moment, which I think is why I'm more inclined to honor her with the familial term, I suppose. There is nothing preventing magic from coming into Privet Drive. There are very specific things preventing Harry from being hurt, as we will find out later, as we'll get in the very next slide, or get intimation of in the very next slide, in fact. But the truth is that the wizard world and the muggle world have only ever been separated by consensus, by the agreement that the separation should exist, and by individual preservation of that spirit of secrecy. But a veil of secrecy is not a wall. This is not something that is actively preventing the incursion that is now being experienced. There is nothing physically stopping Dementors from leaving behind the geographical wizarding world and entering the geographical muggle world as though they were two separate worlds, right? That is how Harry is thinking of it, is thinking of it right here. The arrival of the Dementors in Little Whinging seemed to have caused a breach in the great invisible wall that divided the relentlessly non-magical world of Privet Drive and the world beyond. The world of Privet Drive is not relentlessly non-magical. This is where Fig lives. This is where Dumbledore and McGonagall and Hagrid dropped you off as a baby. Like this is where the Weasleys showed up. Last year and the year before that too. In fact, now that we think of it, like we've kind of been around the houses here. We understand that Privet Drive is not as non-magical. It is assertively non-magical, but it is not consistently non-magical. But the invisible wall that divided the relentlessly non-magical world of Privet Drive and the world beyond, Harry's two lives that somehow fused and everything had been turned upside down. It's because Harry never had two lives. There were never two worlds. There was one world with a line drawn down the middle, but that line only persists because everyone has agreed that that line should continue to exist. Initially, the Muggles apparently are dominant and the Wizards are protecting themselves. Then it seems apparent that in JKR's expansion of her understanding of her secondary creation, that in fact the Wizarding world is dominant and the Muggles are being protected, but it was only ever a convenience, I suppose. And now it is falling down. Alispin, you are magnificent. Alispin says, the Oxford English Dictionary lists materteral as meaning characteristic of an aunt, right? So it comes from the Latin matertera, which refers to a mother's sister. That's consistent with avuncular, which means characteristic of an uncle. So as avuncular is to an uncle, so materteral is to an aunt. That is fantastic, Alispin. Thank you so much for looking that up. See, we learn things here. We learn things. That's a Recyclops saying, that's not fair. Alispin used her librarian superpowers. We should all have those powers. Okay, so Voldemort is bad news. We know this. We get this moment of real humanity from Aunt Petunia, which Harry recognizes and, says, yeah, he then just addresses Aunt Petunia. Yes, he came back a month ago. I saw him. Her hands found Dudley's massive leather-clad shoulders and clutched them, like a moment of real maternal instinct there from Aunt Petunia, which we can't help, I think, but be moved by. Let's look at our last slide of tonight's session. Aunt Petunia's hand was trembling. She looked wildly around the kitchen as though looking for an escape route, but too late. The envelope burst into flames. Aunt Petunia screamed and dropped it. An awful voice filled the kitchen, echoing in the confined space, issuing from the burning letter on the table. Remember my last, Petunia! Aunt Petunia looked as though she might faint. She sank into the chair beside Dudley, her face in her hands. The remains of the envelope smouldered into ash in the silence. What is this? Uncle Vernon said hoarsely. What? I don't... Petunia? Aunt Petunia said nothing. Dudley was staring stupidly at his mother, his mouth hanging open. The silence spiraled horribly. Harry was watching his aunt, utterly bewildered, his head throbbing fit to burst. Petunia, dear, said Uncle Vernon timidly. Petunia? She raised her head. She was still trembling. She swallowed. The boy will have to stay, Vernon, she said weakly. Yeah, Molly Grew saying, lust, creating more fear than the Dementors. No kidding, right? This is... we've got to do some construction of scaffolding in order to really understand what is happening here and why this is as oblique as it is. But we will, of course, catch up with the meaning of "Remember my last, Petunia" when we get to the end of it. Of course, a few people might recognize that voice, but maybe not. I just don't know. Joseph saying, "Isn't the real victim of this chapter Mafalda Hopkirk? It's really frustrating to produce a document just to be told you have to redo it because senior managers have suddenly changed their mind." You know what? This is what Mafalda Hopkirk lives for, right? She's just generating these things. She listens to a lot of podcasts. She's a big fan of, what's that? Dear Mr. Potter. She listens to that podcast a lot as she's generating these letters for students in contravention of the prescriptions against underage magic. Yeah. No, good. Excellent. Now this is this is great from Prisoner AB234 saying, now this is where the "did you put your name in the goblet of fire" oomph should be, right? Yes, you're absolutely right. This is like Michael Gambon could do this beautifully. It doesn't, of course, but could do this beautifully. That is exactly angry Dumbledore. Remember my last, Petunia. We're obviously supposed to believe that this belongs to someone else, but more speculation on that as we move forward. We are already 10 minutes after time. Let me call up here our next session. Since we completed our entire reading this week, you guys, congratulations, high fives and orange slices all round. Next week, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, chapters 3 and 4, The Advanced Guard, and number 12, Grimmauld Place. 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, Tuesday, July the 24th. I hope that you will be able to join me for that. Let me see if we can take a quick look. We've got 5 questions in the question bucket here. There's no way I can get through 5, but let's see what we can do. Let me see. Corporeal saying use... Corporeal challenging me. Use maternal in a sentence. While we may not be impressed by Aunt Petunia's maternal characteristics, we can at least acknowledge a certain sweetness and softness to her maternal characteristics. There, used in a sentence. Asked and answered. Now let's do a Harry Potter question here. Let me scroll up to the top. Ella asks, how much of Harry's anger do you think is his own, and how much do you think is Voldemort's? I think that the metaphor that I want to use for this, as I say, I don't think that Voldemort's anger is being transplanted, or Voldemort's emotional palette, Voldemort's emotional range is being transplanted onto Harry consistently, or that it is entirely subsuming Harry's own personality. That clearly, evidently isn't true from the text. But I do think that Harry is more inclined to feel Voldemortian about things, right? He is more, those emotions are a little closer to the surface. His irritability, his anger, his belief in his own natural superiority and in his right to rule, his sense of righteousness, in fact, his desire for power, his desire for violence. These things are closer to the surface, so they are more readily accessible for Harry than they used to be, than they will be again in the future. So it's not that I think that these are... that Harry is, let's compress all of this down to just anger, right? It is not, I think, the case that Harry is feeling Voldemort's anger. I think that anger is closer to the surface for Harry, is more readily accessible to Harry, is more pressing and urgent for Harry because of the influence of Voldemort. It's like, Voldemort is just a little emotional faucet that has been left running in the back of Harry's mind, right? It's just, there is this constant trickle of sensitivity and of fury and of this predisposition toward violence running through Harry's system. It is like a drug in his vein, or a hormonal imbalance contained within his mind. It's a constant pressure. It's a constant push from Voldemort that inspires Harry to move. That is certainly how I read it, at least. But we're going to continue to pay attention to that as we move forward through the book, and we will look at what is revealed to us in this very close textual reading. Alice been saying it's this constant pressure. Wilhelm saying anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering, suffering leads to chocolate. Chocolate leads to the dark side of the Force. Chocolate leads to the dark chocolate of the Force. That's what really happens. Yes. Good. All right. Let's wrap up there. You guys, this has been an absolute pleasure. This has been just wonderful. We are going to continue to move forward, as I say, next week with the Advanced Guard and number 12, Grimmauld Place. Let me cancel that slide just so I can say goodnight to you. Full screen, as it were. Have a wonderful week, everybody. I will talk to you all again very soon. If you have thoughts, of course, you can head on over to the Point North Media forum at pointnorthmedia.com/forum, or you can email me directly, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. I want to hear your thoughts on Voldemort's influence over Harry at this point, about the Dementors, about Dudley, about what Dudley experienced when he was facing down the Dementors. What do you take from that? What do you make of that? What do you think about Arabella Figg and Mundungus Fletcher? What do you think about Aunt Petunia Maternal, that she is maternal as she is, I suppose, is the way that I should conjugate that, but I really stumbled over that. So let's do a graceless dismount and simply say thank you for listening, everyone. I will talk to you all next week. Until then, mischief managed. Good night all.